This is the Aeon Byte interview, and it's a very special show today. So happy to have back Dr. Arthur Versluis to discuss, well, it's a two-part series called American Gnosis, based on his upcoming book. And this is the first part, which will draw upon the book and some other of his research. Arthur, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it, and you're really doing a service by for your audience by creating these podcasts on Gnosticism in American and global society. I think it's unique, and it's really a great series. So thank you for having me on.
Oh, pleasure is all ours. Yeah, people keep telling me there's a growing interest in Gnosticism, and I can see why looking at our times. But there's always so much more scholarship. Even when talking to April DeConnick, she was telling me, oh, I hope they don't discover anything else because we still have so much of the text and we need more people to do this research and get more insight. So I am grateful for the work that you and other scholars do. April and Jeff Kripal, and so many others, Dr. David Litwa, to really get into these texts and ideas and how they manifest across history as a living thing. So, and a living book would be your upcoming book. Tell us about how this came about, Arthur.
Well, it's primarily about Gnosticism in contemporary American society, but it's also about how Gnosticism has a global presence, because you can't really separate out. The title is American Gnosis because it's primarily North American, although some of the figures in it are South American. And so it's essential. And then the South American authors are very much embedded in a European originating discourse. So it's really a global book ultimately, but it's about contemporary society. And the way the book emerged is I laid out a plan for Oxford University Press, kind of a overall proposal, and they accepted it. And then I launched into it, not really knowing like what I would find. And so it was really a book of exploration. And I ended up with a completely different book than what I started with, essentially not adhering to the plan at all, because what you discover is some of it was in the plan. For example, I have chapters on Gnosticism, neo-Gnosticism. I call the contemporary phenomenon neo-Gnosticism to really separate it clearly from ancient Gnosticism, because I think we're really dealing with different phenomena. When you're looking at contemporary forms of it, you're seeing something that has resonances with late antiquity and with the Nag Hammadi Gospels and Nag Hammadi texts and so on, but it's fundamentally a modern phenomenon. And so that's why I use this term neo-Gnosticism. And I discuss in the book neo-Gnostic films and anime and gaming, and there's always new things. My students right now, right this moment as we speak, are doing in a course are doing their own exploration and are finding things that I've never heard of before that are clearly neo-Gnostic. They have not clearly, explicitly Gnostic resonance. So I go through film, I go through literature, and then I explore also some things that haven't really been ever explored before. And So that's been really it's been just a mind-bending trip to do this book. It really is. And I think readers will find that to be the case too, that as you go into this area, you have to change the way you see things. You cannot look at these subjects the same after you go through this. You can't.
Mm-mm. No, not at all. And yeah, I mean, even recently, there's a show called Silo, a big hit show on Apple TV, very Gnostic. And 6 months ago, I'm doing a biography on Elvis Presley, and lo and behold, I found out he read the Nag Hammadi library, and he was very inspired by the Gospel of Thomas. So, like you said, it's a living thing, and it's more popular than ever. Why do you think there are so many Gnostic themes in popular culture? I mean, obviously, the big suspect, Arthur, is Philip K. Dick. He's inspired a whole generation of writers, directors, video game producers. Jung continues to be very popular just in people's personal therapy and so forth. Simulation theory is very popular. Blake's warning about Urizen and a mechanistic society. Lo and behold, it's popular. Conspiracy theories and paranoia are not even popular. To some, it's a coping skill. So do you think are these the reasons you see for Gnosticism being so relevant, scientific, and even popular?
I think it's just so interesting, and that's why I dove into the research, which took several years to really write up and research before that. I started by looking at, in the book, I look at Hans Jonas and the way he depicted Gnosticism, and I say that essentially it's a 20th century depiction of Gnosticism. It's not that it's accurate, it's that, and he said this himself, it reflects these pre-existing things in contemporary philosophical, literary, religious thinking. And, that is a good way to think about how Gnosticism appears in contemporary society. Ion Ciuleanu, the Romanian scholar, said that Gnosticism could be understood in terms of, like all culture, he said, building blocks. And so Gnosticism this is essentially modern forms of it, neo-Gnostic film and neo-Gnostic literature can be understood in terms of building blocks. So what are the building blocks? Well, I offer 10 of them. And these are basically based on Jonas and a little bit of Ciuleanu, but basically the idea that you have a demiurge, you have an artificial creation, artificially constructed society. Actually, most of neo-Gnosticism is critical not of the cosmos, as people often think, but rather of society. It's a societal critique. So a demiurge, a kind of fake creator, or a kind of construct creator, archons, gnosis, the idea of gnosis, the idea of spiritual realization, that's also freedom, the idea of a kind of savior figure or revealer figure. There are all these different elements and they're building blocks. And so I think it's much more that the building blocks appeal to people as a way of understanding our world, our contemporary environment. And so they draw these building blocks out, some cases like the Matrix series, not even necessarily directly even knowing about Gnosticism. It's just that the Matrix has all these building blocks in it. Mm-hmm. And, the creators of the series, as you know, explicitly have said it, Gnostic, that's who says that? And yet, actually, it's arguably one of the most influential neo-Gnostic film series, even though they don't really call it that. Well, why is that? It's because they're using the building blocks. They're drawing on these themes, if that makes sense.
No, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, I believe in, I was reading your paper, you called it stereotypical gnosis, and you reference John Murdoch in Dark City and the tuning that sort of, I wake up to this evil construct that's keeping me down, and I got to use my innate powers to wake up. So that's what you say is today's neo-Gnosticism, right?
Well, Dark City is one of the great films. It's really one of the great films. If you want to see a neo-Gnostic film, it's definitely at the very top of the list. So you're absolutely right on that. But think about Dark City and neo-Gnosticism in terms of today. Think about, for example, Mark Zuckerberg and quote meta, M-E-T-A, as in metaphysics, as in transcendence. But what is the perverse transcendence here? The perverse transcendence of meta is to create a virtual reality. And Zuckerberg has said directly that he, in conversation, that he sees himself in meta as a kind of demiurge figure, as a kind of God figure with he says Genesis as his prototype, creating this world. Well, I mean, if that's not a contemporary manifestation of essentially Dark City or, artificial reality with a neo-Gnostic building block dimensions, I don't know what is. So yes, these things exist in contemporary society very clearly. And it's not that Zuckerberg is necessarily himself thinking, oh, I'm a Gnostic demiurge, but he's actually a Gnostic demiurge, right?
Yeah. If it quacks like a duck, walks like a duck, speaks like a demiurge, I guess.
Exactly.
And yeah, and even with Elon Musk and is that whatever Neuralink to our brain, that's like straight out of the secret book of John where the archons are now building our minds and everything else. So demiurges galore. So are you saying that the difference neo-Gnosticism and classical Gnosticism is you mentioned the universe, how in neo-Gnosticism you're pushing back, it's more socio-political. Is there anything else? I mean, if Valentinus and Simon Magus came here in a time machine, what would be their critique of neo-Gnosticism?
Well, I think it's that contemporary neo-Gnosticism, first of all, let me say that it's very deep. These themes are very deeply embedded, not only in film like Dark City and Matrix, and there's just a long series of names that I give and examples, and I don't even give all the examples because I delve into some more deeply, but film, video, but then literature. American literature, when you survey it, in the book, what I do is I have a chapter and survey American literature. And I go from Melville, who has been widely in Moby Dick.
Yeah.
I've actually demonstrated that there are clearly Gnostic elements, and I show where he got them. Nathaniel Hawthorne, all the way through to Thomas Pynchon, all these different figures that I discuss in there. The H.P. Lovecraft horror
Robert
authors.
Frost, the Demiurge's Laughter, Cormac McCarthy. I mean, it's so
absolutely.
startling once you start realizing the great American writers are so influenced by Gnosticism. It's startling. Just like England's poet William Blake is a walking, talking Gnostic. The irony.
Well, Cormac McCarthy and Thomas Pynchon, and so many others. What I do in the book actually is I discuss them, but I discuss them in terms of what other scholars say and how many scholars say, oh, look, this is neo-Gnostic. Look here, Cormac McCarthy, he's neo-Gnostic. And so what I'm doing is building the case by showing so many people have already seen this and recognized it. And Cormac McCarthy is an important example because his work goes over into film, and with something like Blood Meridian, it's a classic work on the level of Moby Dick. It's an
Easy.
amazing
My
book and
favorite novel.
very deep. Oh, it's also very disturbing, and
That's,
uh, dark, as really all of Cormac McCarthy is. But that darkness is a distinctively American way of seeing things, which you can see in others as well, like Robinson Jeffers in particular, the great poet Robinson Jeffers. These folks have an American, uh, way of seeing the world, which is, I would say, very. It's dark, but it's also stoic. It's a kind of Gnosticism it's a sort of neo-Gnosticism without redemption, without transcendence. And I show how in occasionally a little bit of transcendence leaks out in Thomas Pynchon, like a tiny little, you see like a little tiny ray of light in the distance,
yeah.
but you're not sure whether it's real or not. And he's not sure either. And the reason I say that is what I talk about in the book is how in American neo-Gnosticism, essentially what you have is uh, not it's cosmological, but it doesn't include what I call metaphysical gnosis, which is this element of transcendence. So this is true of the film largely, not completely. There's some ambiguous examples. Literature almost completely. And in the case of politics, political neo-Gnosticism, or using neo-Gnostic elements in political memes and so on, there's not a lot of metaphysical transcendence there. So the book, so somebody like Valentinus, or even more Basilides really is my favorite of the.
You've written books about it, yeah, great books, yeah.
Yeah, he did some extremely the closest to the negative way mysticism of Meister Eckhart and of Dionysius the Areopagite. He's the classic mysticism. Basilides is really right in tune with that. And so he came to contemporary America and he's looking around. He is not going to find that, in these folks. These themes of archons, the theme of demiurge, these are very contemporary themes. They are ways of understanding our society, but they are not, they do not include the theme of transcendence, or you could call it salvational. Really, it's liberation, I think might be better, or spiritual freedom or transcendence. That's just not there in film. It's not there in literature. It's not there in politics for sure, which is very, neo-Gnostic memes are typically on the right, and we can talk about why that is. And they, however funny they are, they almost never include themes of transcendence. So Basilides coming here would simply not recognize very much. Somebody like Valentinus, he would say, you don't have archons right. You don't have this right. I don't know what you people are thinking. So he would be, so there's really a divorce, I think, or a great distance between what's happening today and what's visible in the Nag Hammadi library. But I don't care, because I'm looking at the contemporary version of this, and I just followed things where I thought, I just followed up. The whole book is the trail of my exploration, and I was just fearless in exploring, right?
Yeah, and glad this happened. Yeah, it is true. I mean, even like in Blood Meridian, you have this very intense novel, a very graphic ending. Seemingly, your stomach's turning, you're losing despair, and then there's that little scene with the guy doing the sparks. Like you said, that little hope of transcendence that if you blink, you'll miss. But it is true, and I think a lot of it isn't the maybe the mythology of the land. Obviously, we're talking the Wild West and its existential dread and danger probably feeds into it. And on the other hand, as I've told people, it's very interesting that the sort of again existential, almost nihilist detective noir and Gnosticism really mold together, like in Blade Runner, The 13th Floor, Dark City, many of Philip K. Dick's novels. Yeah, you notice that these two genres, the Western and the detective noir, are truly American Gnosticism.
Yeah, there is a noirish dimension definitely too. Now, the book covers much more than film and anime and literature. Although I do survey major figures in literature, but when it comes to uh, and I discuss the noirish element to some extent. But that's really interesting that you mention this, because it leads me to think here out loud about that kind of stoic and
Mm.
uh, pessimistic and existentialist aspect of American neo-Gnosticism, which is definitely present throughout the majority of what I survey. Not, by the way, in everything. I want to get to a figure that I discuss in this book, who literally has never had an article or anything written about him in scholarship before. A brand new figure that's in this book, and I want to talk about him because he violates some of these things we're talking about. He's kind of a counterexample, but you're right. The kind of, I want to say, pessimism is a reflection of, and the noirish dimension is a reflection of the society in which we find ourselves. It's also maybe connected to the existential dimensions of the American Western landscape that are so, uh, the desert, the harshness of the desert. That's present. It's a character. It's a living presence in McCarthy's work. It's a living presence in Robinson Jeffers' work, and
Mm-hmm.
in many others. So I can't ignore that. But there's an element also of our society in its contemporary forms as can be understood as a kind of technological trap, a kind of systemic machine in which we're caught. And of course, if it's a machine, it's constructed, and who constructed it, who controls it. These are ways of thinking. And so that's present in somebody like Pynchon, Pynchon's novels, that kind of skepticism of the machine and machine society. That's present in The Matrix. That's present in so many works. And I think it's also a motivating force in contemporary politics, because people feel that, instinctively, that they're caught in this technocratic system. So the perfect set of memes for understanding our place in our position and how we are vis-a-vis this society is neo-Gnosticism.
Mm-hmm.
No question about it.
No question.
Yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. Even something like True Detective season 1 actually has both. It's got the noir detective and the Western feel to it. So that show really did do well. So you were talking about, why does this neo-Gnosticism lean or appeal to the right? Although, of course, if you go online, the Gnostics are still the great boogeyman for fundamentalists and others. Even people like Jordan Peterson, he'll criticize the Gnostics, but he loves Jung. It's like there's this cognitive dissonance. It's like,
Yes.
you can't, they're both connected. But why do you think the right? Why does it move right?
Well, that's what's really interesting. I did not expect this, actually. I didn't expect what I have in the book. I didn't anticipate it. I was exploring. Now, in an earlier book called The New Inquisitions, I discuss this a little bit. I discuss the kind of inquisitorial neocon right and figures like Eric Voegelin, who created this, he had this confused kind of garbled idea that somehow anything he didn't like was somehow Gnostic. And so
he's making a comeback too, Arthur. I hear more and more about him. And
it's
Giuliano
hopeless.
has that famous passage where he's like, everything is Gnostic, and he's confused. He's kind of talking about Voegelin, you know?
Yes, he's mocking Voegelin. He says everything is Gnostic, and he's mocking
Marx
Voegelin.
is Gnostic, Hitler
yeah,
Gnostic,
the supermarket
Krauss.
is Gnostic. The supermarket, my car is Gnostic. My shoes are Gnostic. He's mocking that. Well, the thing is, it's such messed up thinking, because basically what he does is he projects what he thinks Gnosticism is, a projection of Gnosticism, which is inaccurate, onto things that have no relationship whatsoever to Gnosticism, and in fact would have killed Gnostics the very minute they poked their head up. I'll give some very clear examples, okay? So Voegelin typically will say the left is, quote, Gnostic. Left movements are Gnostic. Chinese communism is Gnostic. Soviet Russia is Gnostic. Pol Pot is Gnostic. Well, no, they're not. They're not in any way. None of the themes that we're talking about, not a single neo-Gnostic theme appears in as figure, as instrumental in Soviet Russia. I mean, the Soviet Union. Chinese communism is somehow Gnostic? How is that even remotely feasible? I mean, the Chinese, fell over themselves to destroy in the Cultural Revolution every scintilla of traditional religion of Chinese and Tibetan and other forms, doing incredible cultural damage. In what way is that, quote, Gnostic, unquote? Well, it's not. So you're absolutely right that this dynamic that Voegelin represents, because he's not alone. There's a podcaster floating around who has taken it upon himself to define, quote, Gnosticism, unquote, for us as the very, very bad third current in the West. And so you have faith, and then you have reason, and you have this extremely bad and dangerous current. And so who is this guy? Well, he's just another one of these voices putatively on the right. I say putatively because there's a whole different right. There are different views on the right. There isn't just one right. The far right, the so-called, what people often use as the term far right, is often just people who are patriots. And the patriots, as it turns out, often use neo-Gnostic memes. And I have a whole collection of them. I've got hundreds and probably thousands by now of memes from the right. And so let's just think about this for a moment. Why would this appeal to people on the right? Okay. Let's give some examples. You think for a moment about many of the memes. Often they use themes from the film They Live, or sometimes Dark City, sometimes Matrix with the red pill.
Mm-hmm.
So let's think about this for a second. You look at contemporary American society from a point of view of people who are on the dissident right. That's the dissident right. They're dissidents from the mainstream. Well, a dissident is also, according to the U.S. government right now, the number one most frightening thing in the entire world. So they have against them the apparatus of the FBI, the NSA, Homeland Security. So the federal government consists in a bunch of archons. from the point of view of the memes. And so I have memes that show this and that show the red pill. What is the red pill? Well, it's waking up to the system being against you.
Right.
That's why people on the right refer to themselves as dissidents, the dissident right. So the reason I'm giving all this is that here you have this strange situation in which you have these people who are on the putative right who are attacking Gnosticism. And then you have all of these people on the dissident right who are using these neo-Gnostic memes. Really, that's the main place you see in neo-Gnosticism because it works. In other words, as a way of understanding what's happening in society, those building blocks are correct. That's from the people of the right, that's their point of view. Mm-hmm. What they're seeing directly corresponds to archons, a demiurge, a falsely constructed reality, a hostile society, a red pill, waking up. People refer to waking up with a red pill. It's ubiquitous on the right. Everybody uses it. Even the putative right uses the red pill now. Well, what is the red pill? It's waking up. Mm-hmm. So here you have cosmological Gnosticism, but no Gnosis. There's no real transcendence in any of these memes, but you find the memes really being quite prevalent. So this is something that I've not seen discussed literally anywhere.
I know, and now I feel like Sophia needs to come down from the pleroma. It's like, hey, what about me? Even Basilides, I was even in his system. I'm in a lot of Gnostics. What happened to the divine feminine? And both sides, all sides are like, oh yeah, we forgot about you, Sophia. Men reject wisdom, right? That's just the eternal plight.
Well, it's an interesting question, we're moving right now, I think, through a vast set of changes in what I call civil religion. And so everything is being contested at a visceral level, at an existential level. And so on the one hand, you have various forms of feminism, but on the other hand, you have a movement toward, you could say, it's like the trad wife movement, for example. Right. So you have all of these things polarized in ways that are really unprecedented. I think certainly within the last century, I don't think there's ever been a time that's as, or even close to the kind of existential changes we're going through. And so you're right. Sophia is not present in very many memes. In some, I will say in some. For example, there's a meme which comes from a very famous painting, and it shows this figure of liberty, female figure of liberty, passing across this kind of idyllic American landscape. So you could say that the female figure of liberty has this role in the neo-Gnostic right, the neo-Gnostic memes of the dissident right, I should say. That's fairly prevalent meme. I've seen it a number of times. I think it comes from a painting from Thomas Hart Benton. And it's kind of, I'm not sure it's even modified. So the figure of the divine feminine through liberty, female figure, liberty, that's interesting. So I can't say that Sophia is completely gone from the map.
No, I've seen her in memes, but in relationship to her son, Yaldabaoth the Demiurge. So it's sort of a Freudian expression. She's trying to take care of him. He's burning the world. But of course, the myth of Yaldabaoth and Sophia for modern times, it's wonderful because it really is a great expression of codependence, narcissism, helicopter parenting, the single mother. There's so much to unpack in that myth of Yaldabaoth and Sophia. So I have seen some memes on that.
Yeah, it's interesting, I have to say. And then there are different ways to understand Sophia, because in the Christian theosophic tradition, Sophia, really the mythological dimensions aren't there at all. There's Sophia as this figure, divine feminine figure, who is instrumental in the creation of nature, and then also instrumental in human redemption and the process of human redemption. But the kind of other dimensions of Gnosticism and the mythology are not present. But then that's not a Gnostic movement either. It's using the same building blocks, but in a completely different way, right? So it's very interesting, these different manifestations in contemporary society, I have to say.
Yeah, and of course we have to mention, of course, the work of very popular writers whose followers are easily in the millions. David Icke, John Lamb Lash. They have a sort of modern Sophia myth, right? Sophia is Gaia, or Sophia is this extraterrestrial. Again, the other thing why Gnosticism works today, Arthur, is because Gnosticism, as Eric Davis says, has this sci-fi sensibility, and with all the UFO stuff, the Gnostic myth just sort of it just fits in perfectly with ufology and extraterrestrials.
That's absolutely true, what you're saying. And I have sections in the book, not whole chapters, but I have quite a section on David Icke and his different books and where he's come to, which is so interesting. And then John Lamb Lash as well. I also discuss him, and I try to discuss them, even though there's a little bit of maybe a rancor between, Lash and Icke in particular, but also I don't think it goes both ways, actually. But there's, I have fairly extensive sections on them because they're quite influential, and they actually both came to a place pretty close to the dissident right. So they're not maybe 100% overlap, but they're definitely in that same ballpark. And so their neo-Gnosticism is very influential. And Icke, of course, is in the UK, but he's in England, but he's so influential in contemporary American society and in the memes, especially the reptilian memes and the UFO stuff and so on.
Yeah.
You cannot escape it. And so I have to discuss it. Otherwise, people would see these memes and like, what the hell? But you go back to 1989 or whenever it was, early 90s, and you find, his reptilian, where he launched his reptilian stuff out of South Africa. And that's really had legs. And all of this fits roughly into a neo-Gnostic kind of paradigm. So the reptilian overlords then are the kind of archon figures, hostile archon figures. And so you have reptilian shape-shifting, multidimensional, reptilian overlords. That's your model, maybe. Or maybe it's, some other group that's actually in charge. It just depends which of these, but all of them can be you can plug them into a neo-Gnostic framework and understand things much, much more clearly. Another figure that I wanted to mention briefly is Miguel Serrano. Miguel Serrano is not very well known he's not discussed much on the dissident right in the public eye. But when you go deeper, when you go into the deeper levels, he is present for sure. By deeper, I mean, when you're talking on the level of, say, Twitter, not so much, presence, all these kinds of authors on the dissident right get banned pretty swiftly. On Gab, there's no banning, it's free speech, but you don't see much of Miguel Serrano on there. It's in the deeper levels of the Fediverse. Once you go down into the, or out into the, you could say posting universe, POASTING, the posting universe, you find Miguel Serrano, And Miguel Serrano had a really interesting neo-Gnostic framework, which is essentially that Adolf Hitler was an avatar figure and that he revealed a path of social restoration, cultural restoration that was esoteric, that was neo-Gnostic esoteric, and in a world religious context. So Hitler as an avatar figure, absolutely vast works. I mean, extraordinary works. I've read all of Serrano. I actually got many of his books in Spanish. They were sent me from this special collection, original editions with all these color illustrations. It was really amazing. Serrano is an influential figure in the underground. So I discuss him. He's Chilean. He was the Chilean ambassador, and he forged these connections with people in the German orbit after the Second World War. And then later in life, he created these vast books about Hitler as an avatar. And Serrano is definitely neo-Gnostic. Uses his system cannot be understood without neo-Nazism. And again, it's on the right. Then I have a chapter on a guy by the name of Charles Musès. And Charles Musès is the one I mentioned. He is just, if you get the book for one chapter, get it for the chapter on Charles Musès. Okay. Because he is something else. He was born on the East Coast in America, and he ended up getting his PhD in Christian theosophy. He did his PhD on a figure named Dionysius Frere, he was responsible for these amazing illustrations on Christian mysticism in the 18th century. And 17th, 18th century, in that period, Christian theosophy was a living movement in UK and England, in Germany and in the Netherlands. And so he did his work on that. But then Musès went on after that to found a publishing company. He published the first works in translation of Tibetan Buddhist Tantra, still in print. Then he went to Egypt. He became enamored of Egyptian religion. He connected up with the scientific community and created a form of mathematics called hypernumbers and hypernumbers and hyperdimensional theory. Then he created this all this time he's publishing books, okay? And he's publishing these published articles in the scientific community. He ultimately became a director of a scientific research organization in Switzerland, and at the same time created this shamanic neo-Gnostic path for people based on music, on hypernumbers and multidimensional music. And he created a system of music, which I have on CDs, thanks to a student of his.
Oh, wow.
You listen to the CDs based on a certain time frame, and that changes your physiology and allows you to create a subtle body, light body system in order to get out of our very messed up world. And so this is a kind of nutshell overview of Charles Musès, who is just brilliant intellectually. I mean, there's no question about that. At the same time, what he says is so wild that now, even more than 20 years after his sudden death, he feels like somebody from the future. He doesn't feel like when you think about him, it's hard to think about him as being in the past. He feels like a writer from the future who somehow ended up in America in the wrong time. You know, he's a very strange figure, really remarkable. So I have to mention him, Charles Musès.
Yeah, definitely want to check him out. And It is ironic that you have Vogelin on one side saying Hitler was a Gnostic, and then you got Serrano on the other side saying Hitler's a Gnostic, but for different reasons. So it's a wacky ride with these people, and I love it. But then again, the Gnostics were so wild in the first, second century. You know, Irenaeus is like, you guys just keep pumping out texts every 5 minutes, and it's driving me crazy. So I was gonna say, you brought up a book, and I've talked to you about this. I think it's one of the most important books that people should read, and that's your book, The New Inquisition. I'm actually doing a video on it, which I'm going to add at the end of our interview as sort of a summary of it. But it's important because, again, we've been doing shows on totalitarianism, and I've been doing a lot of work on, of course, the great Hannah Arendt. But most people who talk about totalitarianism, it's like a 19th century, 20th century phenomenon, right? Before it was just dictators and strongmen and so forth, with exceptions like witch hunts or the French Revolution. But your book, I think, is so prevalent because you trace it back to the idea of the church fathers, the heresy hunters, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and how they were the ones who created the idea of thought crime, and everybody has to think together and ratting out your neighbor, and we follow an idea and sort of this mass formation, and it was all created so they could rat out the Gnostics who were hiding. I mean, today on the right, that people call the Gnostics a parasite religion, and so the church fathers needed to get rid of these parasites and whatever. And as you write, this idea continued, and even many of the people who advocated for totalitarianism in the 20th century, they knew about the church fathers. They knew about Tertullian. They knew what the toolbox to use to bring about these regimes in the 20th century. So anything else I'm missing, Arthur? Because I highly think people should get your book.
Well, I appreciate it. And, it's a book that I wrote during a period when, at that time we had the so-called, in quotes, war on terror after 9/11. And so, the book is inflected to some extent with that, but prior to the kind of assertion of hegemony that you see now with the left. And so, the left, as historically has been the case, it's the left that is, of course, there is authoritarianism on the right. There's no doubt that there are reactionary authoritarians. You could see many of the people who seized power, Pinochet, for example, or Franco or others, as really reactionary authoritarians, reactionary against the left. What I didn't include in that book, but really, if I were going to do a new edition today, it would include this what I'm talking about now, which manifests in different ways. So, for example, people refer to, quote, cancel culture, unquote, but it's really the war on the opposition and eliminating dissenting voices from the left. Mm-hmm. And that is the single most, I would say, consequential and extreme development over the last, say, 15 years since that book came out, 15, 20 years. It's roughly that development. And I would have included that in the book because that fits into our conversation here. This is why, and you're absolutely right to point it out. On the right, you have these people who are saying, like Vogelin, who are saying these defamatory things about Gnosticism without understanding the first thing about it, really. Or you have people who are really, they just want to be left alone. They want to have, essentially their own freedom. Freedom, liberation is very important to people on the dissident right. Mm-hmm. They want to be free. This is clear in countless memes. And here, Gnosticism is a movement about freedom. And so that's why it appeals. But there's an internal dissent, which has to be on the right, which really ultimately has to be resolved, I think, if it can be, because otherwise, what you're going to have is this perpetual opposition where the people on the right are the worst enemies of the people on the right? So on the one hand, you have all these dissident right neo-Gnostic memes, and on the other hand, you have people saying, "Oh, Gnosticism, it's a parasite religion; it must be extirpated." And I am the great authority of Orthodox Christianity, which is only this narrow band of confessional belief system, and we have to stamp out the other side. As long as that side isn't called out, as long as that side continues, then you're going to have this kind of internal opposition that I think can't really be resolved. It's not really resolvable because Gnosticism is on the side of freedom. There's no question about that. That is what Gnosticism is about. It's a movement toward being free. And that's not parasitic. It is not the things that these people are saying. It's something very different. And, I think that's a pernicious, I think that kind of thinking is pernicious and very wrong-headed. So
I agree. And why do you think the left did that switch? I mean, I'm trying to think. I assume, and again, this is a hypothesis, I'm speculating, but the left got so involved in secularism that, people don't want to admit it, but something about the American Gnosis is that, and going back to William Blake's warning of Urizen and the mechanistic universe, people might not want to hear it, but we are religious. Our minds are wired for religion and mysticism. In America, being religious means always being rebellious and independent. I know it's side of an irony, but the left went so secular that that's where the propaganda works really well. I mean, the Soviets knew that, and Mao, get rid of religion, we can control people. I know it's paradoxical, but what do you think, Arthur?
Well, it's, you just don't hear much about the Cultural Revolution or about Maoism or about the Soviet Union, or going back to the French Revolution. The French revolutionaries, what was one of the first things they did? They went out into the countryside in Western France and murdered hundreds of thousands. Go Google it. If you're in the audience here, you can look this up. It's true. One of the first acts of the French revolutionaries after the revolution was to go out and murder hundreds of thousands of French people in the countryside. There's a long history on the left of doing that, and that's not something that people want to talk about very much, because it leads inexorably to questions about our contemporary system and where our system is in this kind of dynamic. And so it's not just a matter of, the left has turned secular. It's that the left has inherently in it, and by left, I mean Marxism, communism, it has this lethal, extremely pathological dimension that, or aspect or tendency that has to be guarded against, because it results in millions of deaths if it is given complete authority. And so that's just the truth historically, whether you like it or not. So it's not only that the left is secular, it's that secularism is then bound to a war on religion, a hatred of people in the countryside, rural people, a hatred of culture itself, overturning all culture, all of these things we've seen before and historically. And so, the new inquisitions to fear are inquisitions coming out of that kind of perspective, because they can become incredibly lethal, as we saw in, for example, the figure of Pol Pot, and the Khmer Rouge, and the history of the Khmer Rouge as an example. So that's what I think.
Yeah. And of course, you're separating leftism from liberalism. I mean, I think liberalism and conservatism had their times. They were great. I think maybe we need to shell them. Same with the far left and far right. And like you said, let's look for new vistas with the Gnostic spirit, I would say. But
I agree with you. Absolutely. I think we need new vision. And I think Gnosticism, it uniquely, I think, as a set of building blocks for culture and religion, uniquely allows us to analyze our own time, but in ways that people may find very challenging. This is the thing. You may not want to hear what it says about our society, but too bad, because only by going through that can you come out the other side and create something that's positive and not subject to these extreme kinds of tendencies that I was alluding to. So you're right. I'm looking at the future these days.
yeah, you did write a book about politics and Gnosticism based on Basilides and his vision for the future and so forth. So you are exploring solutions from ancient times and throughout history and so forth. So that's the best we can do. And yeah, obviously, this is the first half of our American Gnosis. I'm looking forward to the book because then we can unpack so much more. I look forward to the anime. I'm a big Neon Genesis fan. I'm not sure if it made your book, but there's so much. Video games, I'm a little out of the loop, but people are always sending me, oh my God, I played this video game. It's so not, it even has the Demiurge and Yaldabaoth as the main character. I mean, it's just so forth and so forth. So there's so much to explore. Anything else you want to tease the audience about your book? Although you already spoke a little on it.
Well, I didn't mention the psychedelics. There's psychedelic gnosis chapter on that, and there's a chapter on future. There's also a chapter that includes some contemporary. I call it Gnosis without Gnosticism, the American movement of Gnosis without Gnosticism and metaphysical Gnosis. And I have some people in there that have never been published on before, as far as I know. First time appearing in this book also. So, and that includes some really distinctively American figures coming in the wake of Franklin Merrill Wolff. Franklin Merrill Wolff was this amazing author who lived in California in the mountains, and he was a mathematician. He had a PhD in mathematics, and then he became a kind of recluse in the mountains, and he had all these spiritual experiences, and he wrote about them in mathematical terms. And so I first talk about him because I have to, because then all these other people kind of followed in his wake, and it's a distinctively American movement, free from religious sectarianism and focused on what you could call perennialism, but with a very Buddhist Gnostic aspect. It's American and Gnostic, and also definitely Buddhist. Almost all of the spiritual practices are actually Buddhist, but the language is Gnostic. So there's some very interesting things in there. And then at the very end, I write about the nature of our era and where we are going and what to expect in the more distant future based on what we're seeing now. And so that's all in the latter section of the book.
Oh, well, we look forward to it, and thank you. So besides your book, anywhere else you want to send the audience, any links or homepages or anything to your work, Arthur? I'll have it on the show notes, of course.
Well, thank you for that. One is there's a little more material about the book on arthurversluis.com, which includes some memes. And then Also, there's Hyros.institute, which is Hyros.institute is a nonprofit, and we have some videos and different conversations on there, and some information that people may find interesting about sacred sites and sacred landscape. But for more on the book, arthurversluis.com. And, I really appreciate the chance to have this conversation and for us to start to explore what's been such a wild trip.
Yes,
so
we've
many
only
wild
just
things in this book.
begun,
Yeah.
as Karen Carpenter sang, and yes,
Exactly, the incarnation of Sophia.
yeah, and I just saw in 1975 there was a poll of favorite drummers. Karen Carpenter was number one. John Bonham of Led Zeppelin was number two. So fascinating things you learn about people. She was an amazing drum. Like, people forget Prince was one of the best guitar players of all time. We forget that Gnosis, but I digress.
These things. Yeah.
Well,
yeah,
Arthur,
that's right.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for coming on the show, Arthur, and we look forward to our next chat.
Yeah, I look forward to it too, and thank you, Miguel. This has been fun, and I look forward to the next one as well.
Likewise.
Arthur?
The origins of totalitarianism and thought control. Most are aware of the terms Orwellian, political correctness, thought police, or brave new world, as well as the oppressive secular and religious systems throughout history that inspired them. Although assumed that these individuality-killing mechanisms are relatively modern constructs, the reality is that they are not only as old as Christianity but originated with Christianity itself. In his book, The New Inquisition, Arthur Versluis proposes that it was the heresy hunting of the early church fathers that spawned the very DNA for later totalitarian and police state institutions. Before the rise of the heresiologists, empires conquered almost solely for natural resources, slavery and prestige. For the most part, subjugated nations could keep their native faiths, customs and ideologies. Religious persecution within an empire usually arose when a certain priesthood or nobility, the earthly representatives of their specific gods, ignited some form of insurrection. Per Versluis, a seismic shift away from this attitude occurred in the 2nd century CE when Christianity began to solidify itself as an organized religion instead of multiple, independent sects. Church fathers such as Irenaeus of Lyons and Tertullian of Carthage saw the need to streamline the dogmas of their maturing religion to gain respectability within the Roman Empire. Dissent or autonomous speculation could threaten the very survival of Christianity, at least that was their rationale. They drew a harsh line in the doctrinal sand, referring to their form of Christianity as orthodoxy, from the Greek for right thinking. On the other side stood the Gnostics, who they labeled heretics, from the Greek to choose, in the context of independent thought diverging from standard norms. The demarcation spread to entire communities, as more heretics were exposed, and the term conveniently broadened to other sects, religions and even political principles. In other words, an enemy was no longer defined by action, outward allegiance or even citizenship, but by their very thoughts. As the Orthodox wing grew and copulated with the Roman government, volumes of texts were written on how to recognize, decipher and correct those who had made a choice away from right thinking. Thinking for the first time in history could be criminalized by the state. This template for totalitarian control wasn't fully perfected until the arrival of the Inquisition in the 12th century. Despite common perception, The Inquisition was not implemented to deal with Jews, witches or other minorities, but ironically against the Gnostics, the rebellious Cathars of southern France. With the blessing of the Pope, and the greed of opportunistic nobles, heresy hunting became fully weaponized to counter the resilience of the medieval Gnostics. Despite the advent of the Age of Enlightenment and democratic nations, history clearly reveals that the repressive formula of the early Church Fathers and medieval inquisitors was never abandoned. The new Inquisition offers the infamous examples of authoritarian regimes and their thought police, the French Revolution corruptors, European/Asia Marxism, Nazism, and various spectrums of fascism. Yet Versluis proffers evidence of intellectuals who influenced notorious despotic movements, directly or indirectly, who were very well aware of the heresy hunters and their methodologies. Many certainly summoned the bogeyman of the Gnostics when needed. The question might arise of why the book is called The New Inquisition, since thought crime is an unkillable contagion that mutates and migrates to different hosts. The answer is the warning of Versluis that the heresy-hunting virus is still considered a viable toxin by many in power, even in free societies. The satanic panic and illuminatophobia of the 1980s and 1990s in the West are two cases that fortunately did not evolve into literal witch hunts. This organization is a Christian Illuminati creating false Illuminati implanted in the minds of the population to create schisms and manufacture threats, making it easier to control public perception. The grim truth is that the heresy-hunting/Inquisition golem will never be destroyed, built in the infernal imagination of those who feel that the greater good means little free will and free thinking. And, as Versluis points out, it is a dark irony that the main scaremongers of these two examples, Pat Robertson and Tim Leahy, were members of the clandestine Council for National Policy. The Gnostics took the first blows from this golem, and beyond countless millions have paid dearly because of nothing more than an idea to punish ideas. The modern-day Inquisitor no longer requires torture chambers or bribed neighbors. The internet, electronic messaging, and social media have made the public's thoughts more accessible than ever. All it takes to contaminate liberty is one wedding day between a dictatorial belief system and the state. Overnight, an individual's thoughts can be transformed into damning witnesses in a kangaroo court. Ideas can indeed change the world. But some ideas are best left in the infernal imagination of certain people, lest we get a brave new world and its golems.
アリス